I like that. Thank you. Now, before I begin my talk, I would like to sing you all a little song. And when I say sing, I mean attempt, because I can't sing. And if you know the lyrics to the song, please feel free to sing along. And if not, that's okay. I just want you to sit back, relax, and enjoy. Every day when you're walking down the street, everybody that you meet has an original point of view. Sing along. And I say, hey, hey, what a wonderful kind of day where you can learn to work and play and get along with each other. Give yourselves a round of applause. That was pretty good. And despite my terrible singing, how awesome is it, right? To think that you and me and everyone around the world are all unique and special individuals who are part of a community. But if I ask you to define community, how would you define it? What does it look like? What does it feel like to be a part of a community? And then when we look at the process of the action of building, what does that look like? What does that feel like? And if I put these two things together, and I get community building. But what is community building? What does that look like? What is the process of community building? And once again, you're all probably sitting here wondering, why is she asking me this? She's the one giving the talk. But that is what community building is about. Self. Looking at me and you and saying, who am I when I wake up? And how do I make my community a wonderful kind of place? And just think about it for a moment. We are all a community within communities. Think about it. Whether your work community, school community, or even your religious community. You all are a part of one, and you bring something special to it. And I didn't quite grasp this concept until I started doing the work with our students that you see back here. And these beautiful, smiling faces are all students who are a part of a program called Community Builders. And we take Community Builder students between the ages of 14 and 18 years old, and we get them involved in issues that concern their community. And they do it by doing these three things: active listening, dialogue, and action planning. And it seems pretty easy, right, to listen and to engage in dialogue, but it's not. And so when I'm thinking about community building and doing this type of work that I do with students, I often question. I said, I think about issues of race, sexuality, politics, gender, and socioeconomics. And I want to see by a show of hands. I want you to think back to your experiences when you were a kid. Did you have these conversations with your family and friends? No? See a few hands, right? And if you did have these conversations, were they easy to have, or were they difficult? And I'm going to go on a long shot here and answer and say that they were probably difficult, because it's never easy to talk about issues such as abject poverty or racial inequality. But we challenge our students to do that. And when thinking about community building and teaching it to students, I ask this question: what can I do to connect with my students? And this quote always comes up: we do not inherit the earth from our ancestors. We borrow it from our children. How powerful is that, right? To think that one day, children are going to inherit our community. And I see a lot of faces in the audience like this: oh no, no. Because that's a scary thought, right? To think that this generation is going to take over. But how scary is it that we, as adults, have not gave them the tools necessary to inherit their communities? So do you think our youth today are ready to inherit our world? I see a people, no. A little bit, right? But that's why we teach community building, because community building teaches children life skills that are consistent with 21st century learning. And not only that, community building fosters a sense of accountability by providing children with the tools necessary to be leaders. And if we want to look at this from an educational standpoint, I always turn to the work of Maurice J. Elias. And Mr. Elias is a professor of education. And he came up with 5 life successes, 5 skills to what will make students not only successful in school, but in life. And without going through all of them, if you look at the relationship building component,
Teaching children how to form positive relationships, work in teams, and deal effectively with conflict. And think about our current educational system. Think about the 3 R's, right? Reading, writing, and arithmetic. But what about that 4th R? What about relationships? We don't teach children how to effectively deal with conflict, right? Just imagine how would society look if we taught students and children how to deal with conflict? Imagine how politics would work, right? Imagine how that would look, right? So that's why I teach community building. And when looking at it, I asked myself this question. I said, Kara, how can we teach children, or adults who act like children, community building to get them prepared to inherit their communities? Because one thing I want you to remember, that children are the future, but they're also our now. And it's important to foster a sense of being in them, because one day, they're gonna take over. So I turned to my youth, and I'm looking at my mom in the audience, and I must say, I'll give you a little bit of an aside here. I'm the product of an educator. And so you can imagine, my mom taught for 34 years, God bless her heart. And in those 34 years, she always found ways to connect examples of her students that related to community. So I'm thinking, I said, Kara, think back to your childhood. Being a child of an educator, public television was a staple in our household, as I'm sure it was for a lot of you here. So there was a lot of shows that I watched, like Barney and Sesame Street, because I always had to watch something educational and fun, yay. But there was always one show that always had a profound effect on me, and that show was Arthur. And I'm sure that show had a profound effect on a lot of you, as I see from the smiling faces in the audience. And Arthur taught me a lot of life lessons, but Arthur taught me what it meant to be a part of a community. As you see here from his title card, created by Arthur Mark Brown, Arthur takes different life and experiences, none other than the ones that I mentioned a bit earlier, and does it in ways that are indirect. Because when we're talking about difficult conversations with students, we don't want to do it in ways that are going to be harmful or negative or put it on them. We want to do it in ways that they can create a safe space. And Arthur did that for me. And Arthur did that for a lot of students too. So why Arthur, right? I'll talk about it a little bit. Because Arthur's community in the show is both diverse and inclusive. And every character, regardless of background or, in Arthur's case, species, has a voice. And we teach children that they have a voice. And these characters represent a wide range of ethnic, cultural, and religious differences. And then the series has those 3 consistent themes that I talked about in relation to community building: listening, dialogue, and action planning. And to be honest with you, the most important reason, it was the most relevant reference for both my students and I that was actually relatable, because anytime I try to talk about an issue of community building that was relatable to me, that I understood, they would give me this look. Really, miss? What are you talking about, right? And it's funny, being a millennial and teaching millennials, I often try to find the ways to connect those messages of community building, because it's so important. So I use Arthur as a tool, because my students never let me forget how old I am, although there's not that much of an age gap. And it's always fun to be reminded how old you are by middle and high school students, right? No. I don't care how old you are, it's never fun. So I use the colorful cast of Arthur and not only apply it to my life and my life's passion, which is youth advocacy and engagement, but use it as a tool to teach students community building using the same skills that I talked about before. Now, I want you to remember, community building is a process. And these 3 things, active listening or constructivist listening, dialogue, and action planning, all work in synergy. Because community doesn't end when, everything is all good. Community begins when there's conflict, and we come together and figure out ways to address that. So let's go into it. So active listening, this is the heart of community building, okay? And this is a term coined by Julian Weisglass. And Julian Weisglass is a professor of education, and he used it to teach Latino and Black students mathematics. And active listening deals with listening not so much with these, but with this. Because it's very difficult to listen to people in, issues of stress when you're angry or you're frustrated, and we learn that by watching politics, right? So I used the example of Arthur in a title episode called In My Africa. And I love this episode because it talks about cultural competency and diversity and explains it in ways that are engaging and fun for students. So in this episode, DW, who's Arthur's little sister, has a friend who comes from Africa named Sheet. And he comes from Senegal, and DW is so excited to share her new experiences with him. So in turn, she draws him a picture of him going to school, and there's lions and tigers, and he goes to school in a volcano, right? Just really jaded perceptions of African culture, but we do this, right? A lot of stereotypes surrounding other people's culture, and a lot of that comes from not listening. So they engage in fruitful and a dialogue, and they listen to one another. And what is at the core of this episode that I really like is that DW, as a listener, gets to make that human connection, while her friend Sheik gets to understand his story and reflect. And then we get into dialogue, and that is the mind of community building. So we talked about the heart. Now let's talk about the mind. And dialogue is the process where you take your cognitive ability to engage with people. And I use this example when I'm talking to my students called Poor Muffy. And this episode deals with something that's very personal, and that's socioeconomics and family structure, two things that are very hard to talk to children. And I see some people giggling because they probably remember this episode from when they were a kid. Came out in '97, I was about 8. So this episode deals with two central characters, Muffy Crosswire and Francine Fransky. And Muffy is what we would call upper middle class, right? She has a certain title of privilege. Her father is white collar, whereas Francine's father is, working class, and like a lot of us here. And Muffy can't quite understand why she doesn't have the same privileges as Francine, because she has money and Francine's family does not. And she asks, so in this screenshot that I took from this episode, she says, so let me get this straight. I have to eat food that other people touch? Poor Muffy, she has to suffer through leftovers, right? Something that's unique to a lot of families. But for her, it wasn't. So she engages in dialogue, and she asks Francine's father a really pivotal question. Mr. Fransky, why doesn't your family have as much money as my family does? And that's an honest question. Because we don't talk about things like money and, why can't we have certain resources that other people have? And he explains to her, in an adult way, there are plenty of perfectly nice people who are rich and some equally nice people who are not. And he does it in a way that's a safe space, not making her feel bad about being rich or making him feel bad about not having the same privileges that she does. But that's when we get into dialogue. And then we move into action planning, or a call to action. So now we heard about it, we spoke about it, and this is about being about it. And this is the soul of community building. And I use this episode of Suellen Chickens Out. And this episode deals with community organizing and civic engagement, two things that really take students and put them in positions of leadership and give them the examples that you can make a difference. And it's never too late to speak up. So in this episode, this is actually my favorite character, because she's kind of like the Angela Davis of the group. She's very big into social activism and engagement. And in this episode, their neighborhood ice cream shop, the Sugar Bowl, which is a neighborhood institution, is being threatened by a corporate chain of a chicken licking restaurant, right? What a funny name, Chicken Licking, right? So then she says, you know what, I gotta do something about this. So she engages the characters in the cast in the show, and she says, we're gonna stage a huge protest at the mall on Saturday. We may be small, but we are strong, and it will take a lot more than cheap chicken to hold us down. Go girl, I hear you, right? But look at that example. And then we're thinking about all of these things, right? We just talked about, active listening and dialogue, and activism, all these things, and how I use them with my students and how you can use them too. And I ask my own students, how does community building make every day wonderful? And they answer this question so eloquently. And they did it to the tune of Chance the Rapper, who's a rap artist who a lot of my students really adore. And he took the Arthur theme song, the one that I attempted to sing, and puts an amazing inspirational spin. So I recorded my students' responses, and I want you to listen to the lyrics. So I'm gonna play it right now.
It's a simple message, and it comes from the heart. Believe in yourself, for that's the place to start. And I say, what a wonderful day. Learn to work and get along with each other. I say, kind day. You can learn to work and get along with each other. Listen to your heart, listen to the beat, listen to the rhythm of the street. Open up your eyes, open up your ears, get together and make things better by working together. It's a simple message, yeah, and it comes from the heart. Believe in yourself, for that's the place to start. I'm gonna get by when the going get rough. I'm gonna love life till I'm done grown up. And when I'm going down, I'ma go down swinging. My eyes still smiling and my heart still singing. I'm gonna get by when the going get rough. I'm gonna love life till I'm done grown up.
That video always evokes emotion in me, for a couple of reasons. One of them being that those students that you saw, Danielle, Caleb, Ben, and Nigel, are all seniors, and they're all going to be off transitioning into their next phase of life in college. And although I'm sad to see them go, I'm happy to know that they took the skills of Arthur and community building and made every day wonderful. And I just want to leave you with this. What we do to our students, they will in turn do to society. So I implore you, make every day wonderful. Thank you.